afternoon, everyone. And thank you to Naomi for the invitation to speak to you today as part of this exhibition and study day. Still life is a theme that I became really absorbed by when I was writing my book, Still Life and Modernism, Artists, Writers and Dancers, quite a few years ago now. And I wanted to explore the notion of still life, not only as a genre in visual art, but to think more broadly about its significance as a mode of being in the world and a form of attentiveness. A form of attentiveness which might migrate across different art forms. And it seemed to me that there was something challenging, paradoxical and provocative at work in the modernist still life. And particularly as the early 20th century has so often been characterised as the sort of age of speed and change. And I came to think of the genre as an unstable but peculiarly vital medium for the expression of modern concerns. So in this talk I'm just going to explore a sort of collage of textual responses to still life, with a particular focus on the modernist writer Virginia Woolf and her circle, in order to amplify, I hope, our notion of the genre and its interdisciplinary resonances. So why might still life be a compelling or provocative mode for modern artists and writers? Well, still life presents a paradox. The polarities of stillness and motion are thrust into uneasy contact as the still, that is eternal yet frozen art object, confronts the rhythms and vitality of life. And strictly, of course, the term still life refers to a genre of painting that depicts inanimate objects, yet the implications of still life in the modern world are much more complex and enigmatic. So a brief detour at this point into the etymology of still life to illuminate things a little further. As probably many of you will know, during the first half of the 17th century, the Dutch used the term still standing things to refer to still life, indicating living things in a state of rest. And it was only from around 1650 that the modern Dutch term stilleven, meaning inanimate object or immobile nature, was introduced. And in France too, choses inanimées, meaning inanimate things, describes still life subjects. But by the end of the 18th century, the French had appropriated the Italian term natura morta, translating as dead nature, and began to refer to nature morte. English writers directly translated the Dutch term stilleven as still life, but another interpretation was silent life. And this term sets up a suggestive alliance between still and the silent that artists and writers continue to address and invoke. Still life is also often described as a borderland genre, situated somewhere between nature and culture, mortality, vitality, private and public space. And it's a genre of painting that has traditionally been positioned as minor in art history, below history painting, portraiture and landscape. And this denigration is partly due to its everyday subject matter, typically food, flowers, table objects, which are largely associated with the domestic or the feminine sphere. But if still life conjures up connotations with humbleness or domestic order, such conventions were upturned by modernist experimentation. And the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which I've been exploring, witnessed the destabilizing of these hierarchies as still life came to the forefront as a kind of aesthetic laboratory for experimentation. So the genre of still life was central to the work of the post-impressionist painter Paul Cézanne, who's widely regarded as the modern master of still life. And it was equally central to subsequent generations of Cubist and Surrealist artists. And it was no less important to Virginia Woolf's Bloomsbury circle, in particular to her sister, the painter Vanessa Bell, and to her painter friends Duncan Grant and Roger Fry, among others. So I wanted to really begin with a question posed by Virginia Woolf in the spring of 1918. The question is, what can 6 apples not be? And her question addressed this painting, Paul Cézanne's Still Life with Apples, painted around 1877 to 8. And it's a painting which might be known to some of you who know the Fitzwilliam collection. So this luminous but diminutive painting, with dimensions of only 19 by 27 centimetres, belies its scale in terms of its sensory impact and the tactile, almost sculptural quality of the apples, described in densely layered paint. It's just one of nearly 200 still lifes that Cézanne painted, in which he reinvigorated the genre, offering a model that reconceives the apparent polarities of stillness and movement and demonstrates a radical mode of perception and attention to humble objects. And some of you might be familiar with the story of how this painting came to arrive among Woolf's Bloomsbury group of artisan intellectuals. The painting was originally bought by Degas in 1896, but in 1918 it was purchased by the Cambridge economist John Maynard Keynes at the sale of Degas' studio in Paris. And on returning to England, Keynes drove down to Vanessa and Clive Bell's rural farmhouse in Sussex with the painting, but he found the track rather muddy and his bags were heavy, so he ended up leaving the painting in the hedge at the bottom of the driveway. As the painter Duncan Grant later recalled, Keynes arrived at the house and told them, "If you'd like to go down to the road, there's a Suzanne just behind the gate." And it's become a kind of apocryphal story in modernism and thinking about Virginia Woolf and Bloomsbury and their relationship to Suzanne. So Virginia Woolf was one of the enraptured spectators who recorded her first impressions on viewing the recently acquired painting in London, alongside her sister Vanessa Bell and the art critic Roger Fry. So I'm just going to read a diary entry of Woolf's to give us an insight into her initial response to this painting. So she writes, "There are 6 apples in the Suzanne picture. What can 6 apples not be? I began to wonder. There's their relationship to each other and their colour and their solidity. To Roger and Nessa, moreover, it was a far more intricate question. It was a question of pure paint or mixed. If pure, which colour? Emerald or viridian? And then the laying on of the paint, and the time he'd spent, and how he'd altered it, and why, and when he painted it. We carried it into the next room, and Lord, how it showed up the pictures there, as if you put a real stone among sham ones. The canvas of the other seemed scraped with a thin layer of rather cheap paint." Woolf's rhetorical question, with its negative cadence, "What can 6 apples not be?" draws our attention to the scope of significance she finds in this seemingly everyday subject. She suggests an excess of meaning at the same time as alerting us to the way in which her relationship to the painting might be troubled by the inadequacy of language to encapsulate it. For her fellow viewers Fry and Bell, as she observes with a characteristic touch of irony, it was a far more intricate question. She was conscious that their formal concerns as painters differed from her own, and the rhythms of her prose are, I think, revealing here. The insistent questioning and repetition betray her unease as well as her enthusiasm. She communicates the wonder as well as the labour of looking and the effort to translate the dislocated temporality of perceptual experience into words. As she'd later write of Suzanne's paintings in an essay in 1925, they were provocative to the literary sense. "The very pigment," she wrote, "seems to challenge us, to press on some nerve, to stimulate, to excite." So Woolf's physical responsiveness to Suzanne's apples alerts us to a form of encounter with still life and a peculiar sense of its animate quality, which is registered by a striking number of her artist and writer contemporaries. She invites us to wonder why the seemingly everyday subject of a handful of apples made such an impact, and what power their mysterious qualities, as she described them, could exert on a writer. Woolf herself was attracted to what one character in her novel, The Waves, describes as the quiet of ordinary things. And her fiction and non-fiction is populated by compositions of ordinary yet remarkable objects, which invite analogies with still life painting and its peculiar eloquence. However, it was with her sister Vanessa Bell's work that she had perhaps the most intimate dialogue. And in a sense, her encounter with post-impressionism was mediated by Bell. The still life was part of Bloomsbury's radical domestic aesthetic. Bell's still life of a vase and vegetables hung in Woolf's home at Monk's House in Sussex, and her view of the pond at Charleston, East Sussex, reveals the rhythmic patterns and blocks of colour that made her rural farmhouse an extended canvas. Woolf's experience of still life painting was not limited to the exhibition gallery then, but framed within and often a kind of extension of her domestic environment. Indeed, she bought Bell's own still life painting of apples after it was exhibited in 1919. The painting might at first strike us as a homage to Suzanne in its subject matter, with the 5 glowing apples and the use of perspective, tilting the bowl slightly at an angle so that the fruits seem rather ungrounded. But Bell contains her apples in an omega-style bowl, and there are also hints of the thin painted stripes of colour on the wall of the ocean, with just a backwards glance indoors. The wavering space Hodgkins creates at the borderland of inner and outer worlds, and the potency of this threshold territory where familiar objects might be more than they first seem, finds a rich vein in modernist writing. The writer Catherine Mansfield was another New Zealand-born modernist who was Hodgkins and Woolf's contemporary. Best known for her experimental short fiction, she first came to London in 1903 when she was 19, and later became part of Bohemian literary and artistic circles in London and Paris, although she was never entirely absorbed into the Bloomsbury group. Like Woolf, she seems to have been drawn to the idea of working over still life painting in words. She too had responded viscerally to Suzanne. And in 1921, she described her reaction to another post-impressionist painter, Vincent van Gogh, in ways which reveal that she too had her literary sense stimulated by still life. She writes of his now famous sunflower paintings, "Yellow flowers brimming with sun in a pot. The picture seemed to reveal something that I hadn't realised before I saw it. It lived with me afterwards." She goes on, "They taught me something about writing which was queer, a kind of freedom, or rather a shaking free." It's striking, I think, that Mansfield found in the chromatic freedom and assurance of Van Gogh's flower painting a shaking free or liberation of her own, which can be felt also in her experimental short stories of the period. Mansfield had created literary still lifes with all the unsettling animation of a post-impressionist painting. In her experimental short story, The Prelude, published in 1918 by Virginia Woolf's Hogarth Press, she evokes a transformative scene in which one of the protagonists, Linda Burnell, who's initially presented as a seemingly languid and conventional wife to her overbearing husband, experiences the animation of the object world, still life coming alive. One of the most striking moments in the story takes place when Linda retreats from the domestic hubbub of her children and servants and experiences her floral patterned wallpaper becoming strangely sentient. She begins idly tracing the pattern of a decorative poppy on the wallpaper, and it seems to come alive under her finger. So I'll just read an extract from this part of the story. "In the quiet, and under her tracing finger, the poppy seemed to come alive. She could feel the sticky, silky petals, the stem, hairy like a gooseberry skin, the rough leaf and the tight glazed bud. Things had a habit of coming alive like that. Not only large, substantial things like furniture, but curtains and the patterns of stuffs and the fringes of quilts and cushions." Through Linda's vision, Mansfield makes the familiar coordinates of the home, the wallpaper, furniture and cushions, the very texture and weft of the domestic environment, unfamiliar. Significantly for our discussion of still life, it's the condition of stillness and silence away from the distraction of children or domestic routine that leads to her mysterious apprehension of the object world. And this is the moment in which Linda's mask seems to fall and the reader's given a glimpse of an alternative version of her character, to the version of her as a sort of obedient housewife presented to her family and society. And we witness her yearning for a rupture in the everyday texture of things, the wallpaper of the home, or the unyielding stillness of the furniture. It's one of several moments of illumination for Linda and for the reader, as we discover her communication with the non-human world. She reflects in this solitary moment that everything had come alive down to the minutest, tiniest particle, and she feels herself floating and waiting, and as she describes, watching for something to happen. More mysteriously still, she has the sensation that this coming alive of things involves them listening. "They listened," Mansfield writes. "They seemed to swell out with some mysterious, important content, and when they were full, she felt that they smiled." This mysterious swelling of meaning and listening silence of objects is, I'd suggest, precisely what we find in still life painting, particularly by modern women artists. In their still lives, object and environment can be transformed and the contours of domesticity and gender reconfigured. And we can gain further insight into the significance of still life for Mansfield through her correspondence with the painter Dorothy Brett. And this is a photograph of the pair taken around 1921. Mansfield on the right and Brett on the left. Mansfield particularly admired Brett's still life paintings and praised her flower painting. And in 1917, she wrote to her friend describing the curious experience by which the writer or artist must become their subject. So I'm just going to read an extract from her letter to Brett, which I think is illuminating about her process. She writes, "It seems to me so extraordinarily right that you should be painting still lives just now. What can one do, faced with this wonderful tumble of round, bright fruits, but gather them and play with them and become them, as it were? When I pass the apple stalls, I cannot help stopping and staring until I feel that I myself am changing into an apple too. And that at any moment I may produce an apple, miraculously, out of my own being, like the conjurer produced the egg." She goes on to ask Brett, "When you paint apples, do you feel that your breasts and your knees become apples too? Or do you think this is the greatest nonsense? I don't. I am sure it is not." For Mansfield, this extraordinarily intense sense of identification with a given object, in this case apples, is emphatically aligned with the female body and its creative or procreative potential. And there seems a subtly feminist point at work here in this discussion addressed by a woman writer to a woman artist, which recovers and celebrates the sensuous potential of the apple and its associations with temptation, seduction, and of course with the curves of the female body. Mansfield offers a distinctive and celebratory vision of creative embodiment, involving both a liberation and loss of self and new birth. So we began this talk with Virginia Woolf wondering, what can six apples not be? And I conclude with her friend, Catherine Mansfield, another woman writer, musing over the creative potential latent in a handful of apples. And I rather like this photograph of the writer, looking particularly meditative and also watchful, surrounded by her still life objects. So for the still life painter or writer, even the humblest or most quotidian of fruits, objects or flowers might provide sustenance and a reflection of her own creative power, casting herself, as Mansfield does, as a conjurer who could produce an apple miraculously out of her own being. And it's compelling that, in Mansfield's case, the realization of her conjuring power is expressed in a conversation with her female friend, a creative conversation between a woman writer and painter. Okay.
Thank you so much, Claudia and Sakai, for those fascinating presentations with quite different views into the genre of still life, which has been so differently used in the history of art, but I think in such an interesting way by women artists, partly through circumstance, but also through their own kind of embrace of it and use of it in very radical and subversive ways. Sekai, in the break, we were talking about how you'd constructed your still life that's in the exhibition, Hint of Blue 2, and how you'd accumulated these objects through different means, and how the objects themselves also are artworks kind of in this series, Hint of Blue. Can you say a bit more about how you went about acquiring those objects and what the significance of them were?
So I guess we'll start with the tablecloth, because that started off as about 20 metres of fabric that I painted with indigo dye. And it's sort of doing that in this sort of meditative, sort of automatic drawing style, and just allowing things to be kind of free form. And I was also thinking about divination, and how certain objects or images can be used to sort of give messages. So I was working with cowrie shells. So if you were to look at the fabric, you'll see cowrie shells are drawn into the fabric in different points. And I was also working with indigo in a really different way from how people usually work with it, because I did have vats where I was making the batik work, but I was also just painting directly onto the fabric as well, with sumi brushes specifically, because I was kind of thinking about the Japanese indigo dye processes in relation to calligraphy and other forms of writing and drawing. So that was the first thing, and that fabric formed the backdrop of the photography work and then became the tablecloth. So it was kind of a very central piece. And then there was the Blue Willow China pieces that I collected, but they were collected in sort of different ways. I was on eBay a lot. And I spent hours and hours looking for different types of, different examples of Blue Willow China from different parts of the world, particularly looking for them at different values, at like a different cost brackets. And I was like thinking, okay, I want a lot of cheap pieces, like, you know, that you can just buy in these big box straw lots of like plates and cups and saucers and stuff. And I also wanted some pieces that were harder to acquire, harder to come by, and so I kind of have a mixture of that on the table. I do have some Delft pieces in there, as well as some pieces from the UK, and the patterning on all of the pieces are obviously unique to whichever part of the world that they come from, and they've got like specific stamps that say like made in Britain or made in France or made in Germany or made in Holland. So that's the kind of that's something I wanted to make sure I had a good range of. And yeah, I kind of also then ended up in a situation where I just have a lot of Blue Willow China in my life. It's just stored in my studio now, because it was really specifically for this project, and I don't really know what to do with it now. But it's yeah.
Maybe selling it on eBay for an inflated price. And Claudia, you were talking a lot about the interaction between still life painting and still life writing, and it's a very fascinating history. Suzanne, for example, was friends with Zola, the novelist. They were childhood friends, and Zola wrote a novel which was quite clearly about Suzanne and about his lack of success as an artist, and it was so hurtful to Suzanne that it ended their friendship. But a lot of people have talked about how Zola in that novel was trying to compete through his writing with Suzanne's painting, and there's a whole passage which has been nicknamed the Cheese Symphony, which I think is very, very French. And at one point he mentions Les Hollandes, which could be a sort of reference to Dutch still life painting. And I was wondering, you mentioned the labour of kind of translating visual images into writing. Can you say a little bit more about that and what Woolf's attitude was to that process?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think there's project. Is that on? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think she's conscious of this sort of long ekphrastic tradition, and the sort of idea of the rivalry, or the that sort of ambivalence she has about responding to painting. And she writes actually a lot about visual art, and yet she's so often sort of expressing herself as someone who isn't really quite qualified to do so, partly because she's surrounded by art critics and painters, but I think it's sometimes a bit disingenuous. And she's often but she's often also reflecting on the power of words to animate the seemingly still art object. So it's sort of a trope that runs through her writing on art, and I think it's more celebratory probably in her introductions to exhibition catalogues on Vanessa Bell.
Yeah, it's such an interesting relationship, and also I was fascinated by Dorothy Brett's description of the apples as being sort of part of her analogous to parts of her body, because there are two works in the still life exhibition that we have by Maeve Gilmore, and in it one of them was a series, and the first was painted when she was going into early labour with her daughter Claire, and she talks about how it's very inappropriate for her to be painting a still life, but various people I've showed round have said that that painting really does capture the experience of childbirth. There's something sort of that's communicated through just the representation of some pears that reflects the body and this very sort of life-changing experience of childbirth. That's more of a comment than a question.
Well, no, it's interesting you drew attention to that though, because Mansfield also was, I think, really conscious of. She was working in amongst a group known as the Rhythmus, who'd set up a magazine, modernist magazine, moving across art, literature, poetry, and the art editor was J.D. Ferguson, who was a friend of hers, and he was a painter. And the front cover for that is an image of a woman and with apples, and everything about her is sort of almost compositionally referring back to those apples. There's a kind of visual rhyme all the way through. And there are various points where you feel Mansfield sort of wanting to rewrite Ferguson's approach to the female body. And that's something that also his partner, Margaret Morris, I think, was doing. So I think that visual image, which was really important to Mansfield's sort of group of writers and artists, is in the background there. So it's an interesting one to draw attention to.
Yeah, and Sakai, obviously you introduced your own body into your artwork. What was your, well, tell us more about your thinking behind that kind of subversion of the still life format, which obviously is mainly inanimate objects, possibly sometimes animals and insects, but rarely the human figure.
Yeah, I think a lot of my work, I do appear in a lot of my work as a performer, so I consider my practice almost like performance to camera in both still and moving image, and a lot of the work is representing stillness and movement. So I think deciding to make a still life made a lot of sense, but then a still life is still and a photograph is still, and I kind of wanted to still engage that movement into the space. So I felt like I should in a way activate the objects in some way. And I think that the two images that I decided to kind of make my final images for A Hint of Blue were the ones that I felt gave a sense of there being a sequence of events that have taken place, a ritual of sorts that's happened over time, and you're only getting access to these two moments, but those two moments are quite significant moments. It's almost like the beginning of the ritual when the candles are lit and the space is ready, and then the pouring of the liquid, which is blue as well, and that kind of moment of shattering, I guess, of this illusion of a perfect space, a perfectly laid table. I don't know if people notice, but the food that's on the table is basically it's been fabricated to look blue as well. Like there's this kind of strange artificial mold on the apples. So I kind of wanted to kind of hint at this idea of like it's just this like kind of unstable space. There's something uneasy here, and something that you shouldn't feel safe or comfortable right now in this particular space. Even though it is a domestic space, and even though it is even though it might look like it's laid in a perfect way. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that various points we've talked about the fact that still lifes were made in the context of the home because that's where people had access to the objects that they were portraying. And I think it's very significant that your work was made during lockdown when a lot of us were contained within the home. And also, Claudia, in your talk, you spoke about the Vanessa Bell painting that was inspired by Suzanne's painting, and Suzanne's is in quite an indeterminate setting, quite an abstract one, whereas Vanessa Bell's is in a specific place, which is her home in Charleston. What do you think the significance is of her locating it in that space?
Yeah, I think in terms of the, I mentioned about the Omega workshops and the interior design company that she was at the heart of and co-founded. And so I think really her vision of the kind of post-impressionist experiment was throughout the home. I mean, it didn't have boundaries, so the canvas didn't contain that experiment. It was, she painted, if any of you have visited Charleston in Sussex, you'll have seen, she painted the mantelpieces, the ceramics, the textiles that her design. So it was boundaryless. Does that go somewhere to answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I think maybe now we'll open up to you all. So does anyone have a question for our speakers? Don't be shy. Great. And we have a mic runner. So we'll take the one there first.
Just a little one. Do you make your own indigo? Do you grow the plants?
I don't grow it yet. Oh. See, this is the thing. It's like it's a process of moving towards that. And one of the things I really wanted to do, but because of lockdown, I wasn't able to. I really wanted to go and visit Abubakar Fanana because he was like the inspiration for the beginning of the project. At his farm and learn how to grow it and learn how to work with it in that capacity. But yeah, I think there's space, there's room for kind of making that journey at some point. And I think I'm going to start growing like my own indigo at home at some point soon as well. But it's tricky. There's a lot of other projects that are kind of also looming as well. I have made a lot of dye bats and worked with indigo for a while now.
I think question here.
Thank you. A couple of things actually. The first is just an observation when you were talking about Virginia Woolf talking about the apples. She was talking about 6 apples, and there are actually 7 apples in the painting.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether it was a different painting or whether she couldn't count or what that was. It was just an observation.
No, absolutely. Definitely well observed because that's certainly the case. But it was the painting that she was looking at. But it's hard to know because some people have said, oh, she's miscounting or she's misremembering. She's writing her diary at home probably after the event. But then she does also, the entry goes on, or perhaps it's in a letter, to talk about this mysterious quality of plotation in this picture. And this is a really curious word that she's using, and apparently it refers to kind of spells and potions. And so I wonder if she's also maybe hinting at this sort of hallucinatory quality when we look at that painting, that there's something else going on there. There's some sort of mysterious sort of hallucinatory effect.
Interesting.
So perhaps that's something.
Yeah, thank you. The other thing was, I was very interested that I think you all mentioned it actually, that still life was at the bottom of the pecking order. And I wondered if that came about because it was associated with women and the domestic world and therefore it was at the bottom, or whether there were other reasons for that, or whether it's just a mixture of all those things.
I think that definitely played a role in it. It was also based on a religious worldview in which it was an act of religious devotion to depict sublime celestial subject matter. So those kind of religious and ancient inspired paintings were kind of at the top, and then inanimate objects or everyday domestic ones were at the bottom, within this kind of religious worldview. But I think undeniably that there was also an element of it being dismissed because of its association with domesticity, femininity. So it was a lot of things sort of bound up together, but what it produced was this kind of double bind where women were restricted to that and then also kind of devalued because of it. But I think my contention with this exhibition is that within those restrictions they managed to convey so much. This quote from Virginia Woolf about what can apples not be, they can communicate everything that they need to through this very modest, lowly subject matter.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome. Do we have any other questions? Okay, maybe we've answered all of your questions in the talks of everything we've done. We brought one over here.
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about contemporary still life right now, because I've noticed it's much more at the forefront, and I just wondered if any of you had names that you could give me of artists that you particularly admire in this day and age, apart from yourselves, of course.
Well, Sakai, are there any artists also practicing in still life who you're inspired by?
Not off the top of my head, I'm sorry, I'm not very good at
That's
recalling
okay.
that level, sorry.
Or just generally the state of still life now, because I personally feel that it's coming more to the fore and being more respected.
Yeah, I definitely think that, I think it's a mixed picture because I think in some ways people are still quite dismissive of it as a subject. I even noticed that when pitching the idea for this exhibition with the art committee, it didn't get a huge amount of enthusiasm and excitement. I think because people see it as quite a sort of staged, traditional genre, but at the same time, I think there are lots of contemporary artists doing fascinating things with it, like Hilary Peckus, for example, who's in the exhibition, who did the very large-scale painting, and I think she's using still life in a really interesting way because of the scale of her paintings and also the brightness of her colours, that she's challenging that idea that it's boring. And she's making it really living. And Maisie Cousins, who was supposed to speak today, also most of her works could be categorised as still life because they have those classic elements of them, but they're often on a very, very large scale, again, very colourful. So I think there is a real moment with it at the moment. Both Maisie and Hilary are in their 30s and 40s, so they're kind of younger artists, and also there are lots of male artists who are using that genre in interesting ways.
Yeah, I'm terrible with names, but I can visualise, because I actually teach still life. At the moment I teach a course called Experimental Still Life, so it's all about approaching it in so many different ways, and it's really exciting. And there are artists who I talk about whose names are just gone from my head. But yeah, and they are all large scale. So yeah, it's very exciting. I think there's a lot of potential. So thank you.
I was just going to mention also that perhaps it's also as kind of, I was just thinking of Lucian Freud. There are a lot of Lucian Freud exhibitions on at the moment, but one that I haven't yet seen but I'd like to see is a sort of flower painting and still life exhibition at the Garden Museum. So I think maybe as we kind of think more broadly about some of these sort of key figures and established figures in the canon, we'll find actually they were often painting still lives, but they're less well known. They're less sort of seen as part of their practice. So maybe it's partly an expansion of what still life meant.
Yeah, bring them out of the shadows.
Yeah.
Well, even Hockney, I guess, with some of his iPad paintings, they're kind of still lives, and also some of his earlier work. So yeah, I think there are these canonical figures who are maybe better known for their other works in portraiture or landscape, but have this still life element in them.
Thanks very much.
I think there was another question somewhere over here.
It's interesting though, isn't it, how that kind of trope of unsteadiness and movement within stillness sort of has carried on right through the tradition, and the way that you're working with that. I like that you were talking about that uneasy stillness. That's so often what comes through in literary responses also to still life, I've found. So, I mean, I was just thinking D.H. Lawrence talks about how nothing is statically at rest, the sense that everything is in motion. Yeah. Interesting.
Hi, so my question is kind of related to the other one, and it's kind of like the history of still art that you were mentioning at the beginning. So you mentioned like some paintings from the 17th century, I think, and then that there was a kind of a revival with Suzanne, and then like with what I hear now, like there may be a revival now. So I was wondering if like it comes and go, if it's a trend like with still art, or if it's always been there, and why may that be, right? Like if it's like it comes and goes, or I don't know if it's like related to a specific artist. I'm thinking like if it's like a comeback now, maybe because of the pandemic, or like what are the things that make it a trend, if it is in fact?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think it applies to so many different art forms. Why are some mediums or genres popular at particular times? And I think that there are kind of social, historical, economic reasons for still life popularity. So, for example, in the Dutch 17th century, it was because there was so much newfound wealth in the Netherlands and this burgeoning art market, which meant that patrons could commission artists, and that a lot of it was about sort of showing off status and the new goods that they were able to afford, which before that they weren't able to. There was this period in the 1630s of tulip mania, which some of you might have heard of, which is a very sort of compelling example of a market bubble which then shattered, and people were paying sort of 5 times the annual salary for a single tulip. Like, it was absolutely crazy, but all of those kind of economic reasons fed into the creation of still lifes. Suzanne is a kind of slightly singular figure. I mean, he was a post-impressionist, so he was doing some of what the impressionists were doing, but taking it further. But I think that still life definitely has always existed. The reason that I was focusing on those particular moments is those are moments that we know about, and there is, what I think is such a tragedy is there are so many artworks that have been created by women in the past which we just don't know about because they've been destroyed and lost because they're not in museum collections, they weren't documented in art history. So there is a whole sort of section of art history that's slightly been lost to us, but I think we could quite confidently say that those works were created because, in a way, how could they not be? I mean, it's the most accessible type of art making in the world to paint flowers and fruit sort of throughout history.
Yeah, and I was going to add to the point about the pandemic, potentially people being in their houses and like, what are you going to do, all the things that you have in your house. And I don't know if I would have maybe even made a hint of blue if it wasn't for the pandemic, because I had so much time and so much space to kind of just, focus in on what was actually inside of my house. And I hadn't thought about still life since art in high school when we were doing it, and it was like that was the fundamental. You needed to understand how to, to draw like through that practice specifically before you could even move on to trying to do portraits or work with the body. And I really like what you said about like putting having your students like try lots of different ways to approach it, because like one of the most significant things for me as an artist when I was like 14, 15, my art teacher invited us to pick one object and make 30 drawings, 30 different types of art with this one object. And I remember picking a safety pin and making 30 different things, like sculptures, drawings, photographic pieces, like so many things with just this one thing. So I think it kind of goes back to that. It's versatile and it's accessible.
Made me think, I think that's absolutely true about the sort of during the pandemic, sort of the limited resources in a way, sort of having to kind of re-energise and think about what you could make out of these sort of simple kind of quotidian objects. And I was teaching with the Royal Drawing School, and we had a course on a studio of one's own, sort of riffing on Virginia But we often set up the sort of still life arrangements by windows or at threshold spaces, because there was such a yearning to travel imaginatively, wasn't there, during that time when everyone was so sort of enclosed, and so that the still life could be could contain within it the potential for imaginative travel and dream and exploration beyond the close at hand. And I think that's something that the genre contains within it.
Yeah, and a lot of the works that you were talking about were probably made during the Second World War,
Yeah,
potentially.
yeah.
Yeah, so again, when people were sort of in the home and trying to find ways to pass the time and to document their experience in artistic ways. So yeah, there are definitely these sort of moments in history that have been conducive to still life making.
And I think that early 20th century also has a sense of valuing the everyday as a subject for great art, for literary and visual art, you know, and sort of that moments of illumination can come even whilst focusing on the seemingly mundane detail, you know, and you see that throughout the literature as well, of period in James Joyce or in Woolf. So yeah.
I'm just thinking actually, I was just wondering if the renewed appreciation of still life as a genre. So I was just wondering if the renewed appreciation of still life as a genre through the pandemic may also have been due to sort of the equalising effect that lockdowns had. So a lot of artists are living and working in those conditions continuously, with having to work from home, and sorry, women being less likely to be able to afford studio spaces and have gallery representation and get projects funded in general. So it kind of made it, all artists are in the same boat effectively. So maybe other art practices were put them in a different light, like had maybe more attention on practices, because the more kind of attention-seeking practices were not able to be taking place. Like, you know, people couldn't get out to see things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it so often comes back to what materials and subject matter is accessible to artists. There's an exhibition on at the South Bank Centre at the moment, organised by the Kussler Trust, which is artworks made by people in prison, incarcerated people, and it was curated by Ai Weiwei this year. They always have a kind of artist curating these exhibitions, which are annual. And I went to see this one, which is a sort of larger scale one, and it has sort of 2,000 works in it or something. And so many of those works are still life, because again, it's a material that these people have access to. Actually, a lot of them were sort of fry-ups, like really amazingly made, sort of out of ceramics or various different materials. I'd really recommend the exhibition. It's really fascinating. But I think always it's when looking at art history, you have to think, what are the conditions in which these artworks are being made? Yeah, is that something that resonates, Sakai, with when you're choosing your different mediums and subjects?
Yeah, I think for me, I don't necessarily think, oh, I want to do sculpture, or I want to do photography or whatever for a project. It's like the process of making something insists on like what it is that it wants to be. So for a hint of Blue, I wasn't thinking I'm going to make a still life. It just became one because I was collecting all of this material, and it just sort of insisted on becoming a still life work, and insisted on also becoming this like tableau photographic piece as well. So I think it's like following the material, following the process with the material, and just sort of allowing it to take form.
Yeah, I love the idea that it's insisting to be made, that it has a will of its own. That's, yeah, brilliant. Are there any more questions? Okay, one at the back.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if that's accurate to say that still life was the first non-religious genre in world history, because from what I can think of, it seems like all of the paintings, sculptures, whatsoever before that was sacral and religious, and it had a certain purpose. And still life seems to be the first strictly decorative genre. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question because I think that still life has an interesting relationship with religious belief because still life has been around since before Christianity or other religions came to be, in 15th century BC. And Pliny, the Roman author, speaks about still life. And it's interesting because even then, he's quite dismissive of it. He calls it rhyperography, I think, and the way that he talks about artists who use rhyperography is in these slightly dismissive terms. But there's this paradox because he talks about, there's this competition between two artists called Zeuxis and other artists that I can't remember the name of, but basically they're competing over who can make the most realistic still life. And one of them shows his canvas and and a sort of bird or something flies into it thinking that it's great, and then the other one shows it and the artist himself sort of tries to pick up the fruit. So there's some kind of, I think not the accurate story, but something like that. And Pliny kind of praises them for creating these very lifelike artworks, but at the same time he's dismissing them for his subject matter. So there's this weird kind of paradox going on. And then within a kind of Christian context, it was denigrated because of this kind of religious hierarchy of subject matter. And then the reason why in the Dutch Golden Age it was seen as a more acceptable art form is because there was the Protestant Reformation and there was greater kind of openness to different types of religious practice and belief. But still, within that, the secular subject matter, often there would be these vanitas symbols, which vanitas is a biblical word, and it carries this kind of grave theological warning about the brevity of life and the vanity of material goods. Now, when religious belief in Western countries is kind of on the wane, I think that still lifes don't often carry that same religious message, but a lot of them do still engage with questions of life and death, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and just as one more point, I think that also in some of the early religious painting, that on the side panels or internally, there would be depictions of still life before, so you would encounter that and then open up and find the religious iconography or representation within. So there was a sort of, that still life was part of that movement from the secular and the everyday into the sacred. So it could be part of that contemplative experience in sort of devotional paintings.
Do we have any last questions?
I might be going a little bit tangential here, but you did mention the etymology of the title Still Life earlier, and I was sort of intrigued to know, reading through the brochure, where you're using still lifes as the plural rather than still lives. I just wondered if anybody had any comment on that. Sorry if I'm being a bit pedantic.
I don't know if I could pinpoint it exactly, but it's interesting. All these nuances are really interesting, aren't they? Because being still alive or still lives and still lives, they all have different nuances of meaning. So I don't know if you came across that in your research, but
Yeah, I remember when I wrote big essay in still life as an undergraduate, and when I was doing all the reading for that, I was really sort of taken aback when I saw that that's its plural form. That does seem to be the kind of prevalent, plural of it. And I don't really know why.
I think it must be the slippage. It must be the translation from the Dutch, because that's how it works its way into the English translation. But yeah, it's curious.
Yeah, and it does have really interest. It's really interesting to think about the translations of that term, because in French it's nature morte, which is dead nature, which emphasizes the dead part of it more than still life. So the term that we have is from the Dutch, I guess, isn't it? Because they were the ones who coined that term. But yeah, it's fascinating to think about that, and also sometimes people sort of hyphenate it. I've seen.
Yeah, I think all that semantic slippage and cross-translation is sort of partly what makes it so rich, because it has all these different associations, and as you say, a much more negative, more deathly kind of emphasis in the French. And as soon as it's translated, there's this potential for life and animation and liveness in there. So that's why I sort of thought about still life as such an expansive term. In a way, it allows for movement and transformation.
And also, as we were speaking about earlier, the fact that it has stillness within its title sort of begs to be kind of challenged, and so many artists have introduced an element of movement and dynamism within the stillness, like Sakai. Yeah. Actually, I have been meaning to ask you about how you captured that exact moment when the.
I honestly, I feel as if sometimes when I'm making the work, things just happen. And in the pouring of the liquid, I wanted it to be visible, but the cup is like this, right? So you can't see inside it. And I just kept thinking, I would like it to be visible that this is definitely blue liquid that I'm pouring into this cup, and I want it to have some sort of, maybe the light could kind of glint off of the liquid in some way to sort of make it visible. And then in a moment when we were taking the photograph, we just looked at all of them and we're just like, wait, hold on a minute. And it was just that it captured the spilling moment, which I was really upset about. I was like, oh, I've spilled it on the tablecloth, and I'm gonna have to figure out how to get it out. And it was like a happy accident, or like a sort of these things happen when you're making photography actually quite a lot, where some sort of little magic moment happens. And, yeah, so I was really fortunate that it happened, and every time I look at it, I'm a bit like, okay.
When I first noticed that, I was like, how is it possible that it was captured in that exact moment? Was it photoshopped? But
oh yeah, it happened. Literally happened, and then we then had to try and keep doing it, because I was like, I want to get it as perfect as possible. But I think when it happened the first time, it was like fine, but the one that is the final one is the one that we had to keep on trying to make it happen again and again. So I did put a bit of a towel after that had happened.
On your stage set, yeah. So do we have any last questions? Yes. Okay. 2 more.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I was just wondering, Claudia, you mentioned the sort of areas of your book. You said it was artists, writers and dancers, and we've obviously covered the artists and the writers, and I was wondering how dancers and how dance, how that fits in with this topic.
Thank you. So there's a chapter on still life and motion. Missing the mic. There's a chapter on still life and motion, and that looks at modern dance and how modern dance, early 20th century dance, was exploring ideas of stillness and kind of potency of being still. And as we've been discussing, how nothing is ever really still, that there's always this sort of point of animation. And I was looking at Margaret Morris, who's an early 20th century dancer, and her partner was Jodie Ferguson, a painter, and she was part of a kind of constellation of artists and writers, Catherine Mansfield being one of them. And so it explores her work and the relationship between her dance and sculpture that Ferguson was making, and photography, and that the way in which photography could kind of play with capturing movement and stillness. I also looked at Rudolf Steiner's Eurythmy and ideas around movement and stillness in that practice. That was the chapter on dance.
Thanks, that's really interesting. Just a random thought. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about the word indigo being used as one of the colours in the rainbow. It's described as the blue section, and it had some controversy about it not Newton naming it that, but then it not having the part of the spectrum not having any relation to the actual colour that's produced, and it's quite mysterious why he called it that, that particular word for. I just wondered if that's something you came across in your research.
Okay, this is going to take us on a completely
Sorry.
It's going to go tangential, but it's kind of in a similar wheelhouse, which is that I've been doing a lot of research on the chakra system. So I worked with red first as the root chakra, and then I was doing a lot of I was trying to force myself to do a lot of this, which is like public speaking, and the throat chakra is blue and it represents communication, and that would have obviously been the main thing. But then when I looked at indigo and wanted to work with indigo because of its relationship to the to colonialism and trade, I ended up finding out obviously that indigo would represent the third eye, which is the visioning. So I was like thinking about how we bring something from our imagination as artists, we bring something from our imagination down into a space where we can communicate it to others. So that's strangely blue and blue are they're still the same colour, and there's been a lot of contention about whether it's kind of a purple, but it's not. Like, it's purple to some people in a way, but it's like, yeah, it's like that kind of distinction about how everyone sees colour differently in a way. But I don't know enough about like Newton's decision making in that area. I just thought it was an interesting aspect of why indigo and blue became part of my process.
Yeah.
Great, so maybe we'll finish there, but please do feel free to stick around and have, continue your still life drawing and have some more tea. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I really appreciate it, and it's been a wonderful final event to go alongside our exhibition. Thank you so much, Claudia and Sakai, for your fascinating contributions today. So let's give them a round of applause.